We need another look at the trials of Jesus, and we need to range more widely than the story simply as told by Mark. Last time, in fact, we mentioned Thomas. I think it would be as well if we read the bit about Thomas that we didn't read then. So instead of reading a bit of Mark, would you read, please, John chapter 20, verses 24 to 29. Last time we focused especially on the way that Jesus' own followers in effect put him on trial. We included ourselves amongst those followers. I want today to look at the way that Jesus is put on trial by others, by non-Christians. There are some classic arguments and accusations, and we'll look at some of them. First of all, his existence. One I often used to come across as a school teacher is the accusation that Jesus never existed, that his story is made up, the whole of the New Testament is pure fiction. Some of the kids seemed to adopt this stance almost as an act of faith. It's founded, of course, on profound ignorance. They don't really have any clue what they're talking about, but even when you give them the information, they persist. They know better than the facts. So what are the facts? Well, take someone from a similar period of history, shall we say Julius Caesar. Did he exist? All the kids will say yes, of course. Nothing hangs on their answer as far as they can see, so they have no reservations, no problems. The fact is, we have much better documentation about Jesus than we do about Julius Caesar. Yes, also, but what we know about Jesus is in documents written by a religious crowd to put their own case. We don't trust those documents. I want to make 3 comebacks to that accusation. Number 1, the general point against that is that most documents which tell us about historical figures were written with a particular slant, or as we say these days, a spin. There are very few unbiased sources, if any. Almost all history is written by the people who won. The particular point to make about Julius Caesar is that most of what we know about him we know from books that he wrote himself. Oh dear, I would say that's very much more dodgy than books written by a selection of supporters. Number 2, if you're trying to establish, if all you're trying to establish is the existence of Jesus as a religious leader, then there are several references to him in Roman documents whose authors have nothing to do with Christians and Christianity. For instance, the Jewish historian Josephus makes a clear reference to him in his Antiquities, Book 18. I'll read it. Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise teacher, if it be legal to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men amongst us, had him condemned to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive again the 3rd day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct today. Also, there's the Roman historian Tacitus in his Annals, section 15. He says, Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea, in the reign of Tiberius. Or the Roman administrator Pliny also refers to him in a letter back to Rome. This reference is all the more believable because Pliny gets the name slightly wrong. He calls him Christus instead of Christus, and that makes it extremely unlikely that this letter was written by a Christian supporter. Then my third point. Looking at the New Testament documents themselves, if they'd been written to create a fictional character, I don't think they'd be like they are. Who in his right mind would create such a fiction by having 4 versions of the biography which don't always agree with each other? The variety within the 4 Gospels and the occasional clashes between them strongly suggest that they go back to a genuine person, not that they were created as the result of a conspiracy to defraud. If you've read much of the ancient religious documents, something which strikes you about the Gospels is their almost deadpan restraint. There's very little by way of froth, that excessive, tasteless enthusiasm which downgrades most other religious writing. They read as if they're simply talking about what happened. And that simplicity is extremely hard to create if you're perpetrating a fraud. And in the Gospels, the fiction theory requires that 4 separate writers all managed it. I don't think that's on. Another classic accusation against Jesus refers to his death and resurrection. It's that he did not die on the cross, but that he only seemed to die. This is the official line of the Muslim Quran. That they say there, we killed Christ Jesus, the Son of Mary, the Apostle of God, but they killed him not, nor crucified him, but so it was made to appear to them, and those who differ therein are full of doubts, with no certain knowledge, but only conjecture to follow. For of a surety they killed him not, nay, God raised him up unto himself. Muslims understand God raised him up to mean that God took Jesus into heaven without his having to die. Muhammad, supposedly the final prophet, was quite happy to see Jesus as a prophet, but clearly couldn't cope with the idea of the resurrection of Jesus. If I were trying to disprove the resurrection, I'd do it by dismissing the stories of the resurrection appearances, some of which are a bit weird anyway, walking through doors, miraculous catches of fish and that sort of thing. But Muhammad takes all those stories and in a sense affirms them by saying that Jesus was alive during that period. I think that's wonderful. He then makes the accusation that Jesus only appeared to die on the cross so that the resurrection appearances could be a part of his ordinary life. I think that Muhammad shot himself in the foot there. Definite case, I think, of trying too hard. There is then a whole class of accusations against Jesus along the line that we can't be sure of Jesus in the same way that we can be sure of scientific results. People who make these accusations seem to think that scientific results are completely straightforward and certain, and that what we know about Jesus is on a far lower level of certainty. My only difficulty in dealing with this one is to stop myself going on it for the rest of the day. I must choose some select points. Number 1. The purest form of scientific knowledge is, in a sense, pure mathematics. Surely, these people say, in maths, our knowledge is absolutely certain. We can establish everything we want by incontrovertible proofs. Well, yes, you can, provided you agree as to where those proofs begin. The structure of mathematics is that you start with a set of assumptions or axioms, and that you then use a set of agreed rules to produce further statements known as theorems, and these theorems are certainly are established by incontrovertible proofs, provided you agree on the axioms in the first place and you agree on the rules for manipulating statements. If you don't have that level of agreement, the theorems are unproved, possibly even meaningless. If you don't agree on how to begin the game of mathematics and on how to conduct it, then the game does not produce any new knowledge at all. It is for you pure make-believe. Another point. Since Galileo, most advances of knowledge in the hard sciences have followed a pattern which he devised. You make some measurements in an experiment, and then you try to produce some mathematical formulae or equations which can be made to produce the numbers that you found in your experiment, or at least something fairly close to them. These days we refer to those formulae as a mathematical model of the situation that we're looking at. The apocryphal story of how Galileo first did that is that he was investigating the claim that light and heavy objects fall to the ground at different speeds, so he dropped objects of varying weights over the edge of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, only to find that they all arrived at the ground at the same time. In fact, he arranged the experiment more subtly than that. His laboratory was just over the road from the Leaning Tower, and instead of dropping his objects, he rolled them down an inclined plane. They then moved more slowly, and it was possible to arrange a way in which he could note the times at which the objects passed by certain markers. He then noticed that all the objects that he dropped had essentially the same timings, irrespective of how heavy they were, and he devised some mathematical rules for producing numbers following that pattern, that the distance that something drops is proportional to the square of the time for which it's been falling. Newton then took that work and built it into a larger model, which works so well that it's good enough for getting a spacecraft to Mars or even Jupiter. But Newton's laws of motion, as they're usually called, aren't really laws at all. There's nothing in the universe which requires that everything must behave as Newton dictates. They're not laws in that sense. They're merely the starting rules of a mathematical model, of a way of producing numbers which seem to correspond to physical reality in a wide variety of contexts. But in the last century, Einstein's relativity theories have dealt with very large-scale situations which don't follow Newton's laws, and quantum mechanics has done the same for extremely small-scale behaviour inside the atom. And then Stephen Hawking and others tried hard to produce a single theory which would work like Einstein's works on the large scale, quantum mechanics on the small scale, and Newton's laws for everything in between. So far, this theory of everything has eluded them. But what happens to the certainty of scientific knowledge? In place of certainty, we have a set of rules which we're prepared to use until or unless something shows us that a better set can be produced. So scientific knowledge may be very useful, but it's hardly certain. At best, it's provisional. In fact, a very great deal of what passes for scientific knowledge has in fact been established statistically. The example I like best is of the first survey conducted to explore a possible connection between smoking and illness. 1955 to 56, 949 people took part in a survey in Newcastle upon Tyne, and they were classed as smokers or non-smokers, classed as bronchitic or non-bronchitic. The actual survey looked at other factors as well, but we're simplifying it. And the most basic statistical treatment of this data is to compare it with the figures that there would be there if bronchitis were randomly distributed across the population, irrespective of smoking. There are sophisticated techniques for comparing these two sets of figures, but an entirely amateur look at them strongly suggests that smokers have a lot more than a random share of bronchitis. It's by statistical techniques like that that information is gleaned within the soft sciences. Various theories might be advanced as to just how it is that smoking and bronchitis are connected, and they will fall short of the sort of rigorous model that we associate with physics, and they can only be tested by more detailed and sophisticated statistical methods. Even when you subject mice or rabbits to smoking in the laboratory and see how many of them acquire health problems, that still doesn't give you firm knowledge about what happens to humans. We're still some distance from the sort of certainty that most people expect of science. I hope I've created the impression that whichever branch of science you're in, the certainty of your knowledge is nothing like that popularly expected. Most scientific knowledge is provisional. It's our best theory to date, and we'll use it until or unless someone shows us that we should change something. So I don't think that the certainty of our knowledge of Jesus contrasts that markedly with scientific theory after all. Each of us has made a judgment about Jesus, pronounced a verdict in our own trial of Jesus, and that judgment acts as the basis of what we do until or unless we find we need to modify it in some way. That's much the same sort of pattern that scientific exploration follows. There is one other consideration while we're thinking of other people's trials of Jesus, and that is the evidence that other people glean from your life and from mine. When we speak about giving your testimony, we usually think about sort of standing up and telling your story. The testimony or witness that you give, however, is very rarely in that kind of storytelling. Mostly it's in what people gather from the kind of person you are and the kind of things that you do. If non-Christians ever sit down and start arguing about Jesus, they might wander over the kind of territory we've explored in this study. Most of the time, though, they don't do that. Most of the time, their judgment of Jesus is updated by much more intuitive reactions to the Christians around them. Their image of Jesus is heavily governed by their image of Christians. So in the trials of Jesus conducted by non-Christians today, it's very likely that you will be found giving evidence. Oh, you might be called on to give the kind of expert evidence that depends on your having thought about the issue so that you can answer questions about it. But you will certainly be likely to give evidence by default, just because they look to you as an example of what Jesus does to someone's life. Bless you.